Hello everybody and welcome to the Law of Tort for the SQE. This video is going to be an introductory video to essentially provide you with an overview of the tort module for the SQE, for the Solicitors Qualifying Exams, and to essentially provide you with a brief overview of what the scope of this series of videos is going to entail, given that this is a series of videos that is intended to be supplementary towards your studies for the SQE. We'll talk about the specification, we'll talk about the idea of the law of tort, and we will talk about some citations and further reading for you to look into as time goes on throughout this series of videos. So just like with every single other module for the SQE, and within the SQE specification in itself, the tort module requires you to apply relevant core legal principles and rules appropriately and effectively at the level of a competent, newly qualified solicitor in practice to realistic, client-based ethical problems and situations. So, as I've mentioned in previous videos, in previous introductions for previous modules, the standard here is slightly higher than the original standard that had been set by the LPC, and essentially the point of this is to raise the bar to an extent, to no longer include the standard of a newly qualified trainee solicitor, but instead to the standard of a newly qualified solicitor in practice. And you have to apply these principles to realistic, client-based and ethical problems and situations, something that you will be familiar with if you have gone through and prepared yourself for some of the SQE1 specification or the SQE1 exam, which exams, plural should I say, which of course involve you to go through different problem questions, lots of different problem questions, and to formulate the correct solution to a variety of different questions put to you. Now, within the law of tort specifically, for those of you who come from a non-law background, the law of tort concerns essentially civil wrongs for which there is some kind of compensation, for the wrongs that have been incurred onto you. Now, we will get into looking at the definition of the law of tort in more detail in the next lesson and exploring that in more detail there. But fundamentally, there is a very clear indication that the law of tort encompasses a variety of different subcategories, the variety of different torts, plural. And the broad area of studies are divided into some of these different torts, into some of these different substantive topics. You have, for example, negligence, you have remedies and defences, you have occupiers liability, you have product liability, and then you have nuisance, as well as the rule in Rylands and Fletcher, a specific case which gives rise to the establishment of a tort for that particular instance. And so for the most part, these include various different types of torts. It doesn't include every single type of tort. It doesn't include, for example, defamation, which is, of course, its own tort that you don't study here in the SQE, but it covers the main ones. The most important of these torts, of course, is negligence, which we will spend a lot of our time exploring. But this is just the broad overview of the specification. The specification does go deeper, which is where we're going to outline the scope of this series of videos. Essentially, what we will do is take a look at some introductory concepts. So we will examine the idea of tort, what tort is, some of the basic principles of compensation. You'll be able to link some of your learning and your knowledge from the areas of study for dispute resolution into the early lessons here for the law of tort, because we will talk about some of the procedural aspects that are important. Of course, we won't go into the same kind of detail that we do when we look at dispute resolution. But then from there, what we will do is start looking at the substantive topics. Beginning first with negligence, there is a lot that needs to be unpacked and needs to be covered with negligence. We will probably spend a good 30 or 40 lessons looking just at negligence, because negligence involves examining the duty of care. We'll examine a breach of the duty of care and the standard of care. We'll talk about the issue of causation and the various different cases of causation that are necessary for you to understand. We'll examine the idea of causation in law, sometimes known as remoteness, personal injury and death claims, and then start looking at some specific types of negligence cases. So pure economic loss cases, psychiatric harm cases, and employers' liability cases. From there, we will look at defences and remedies, looking at the volenti non fit injura defensive remedies. We'll also talk about the defence of contributory negligence, or the concept of contributory negligence, and the concept of illegality, before moving on to the next major topic, which concerns an examination of vicarious liability. So what the difference between employer's liability and vicarious liability is. What is vicarious liability? We'll explore that. But then we will start talking about occupier's liability, where we will examine the two pieces of legislation concerning occupier's liability, the Act from 1957 and 1984, the duty to trespassers, for example, as well as defences and exclusion of liability. We'll explore and spend some time talking about product liability, including the Consumer Protection Act, in the next topic, before then looking at the final topic. The final topic concerns nuisance. Nuisance can be divided into two broad categories. You have your public nuisance and you have your private nuisance, and then there is the additional factor that fits on at the end of nuisance, which is of course the case of Rylands v. Fletcher. Rylands and Fletcher is one of those cases that gives rise to a tort that is very similar to a nuisance, but is sort of different enough for it to constitute its own separate thing in many ways, before finishing by looking at remedies. Now, in terms of citations and sources, you'll notice that on screen here is a collection of citations of sources. Some of these are SQE specific, so the final source here, the 4th edition of the Tort SQE textbook, is of course going to be very relevant for you for following along with the specification. But you should know that if you understand the specification and you understand the concepts that you are looking into, you could also find yourself looking at other areas or other textbooks that definitely go into more detail than you probably need for the SQE. But if you're somebody who finds that reading around a subject or reading into more detail of a subject gives you a better understanding, then feel free to do that throughout this series of lessons and throughout your SQE studies. But just bear in mind, of course, the SQE is very vast in terms of the knowledge that you need. So don't be going in and reading lots of chapters about things that you don't actually know, or need to know, should I say, if you feel that that's going to hamper your overall studies for the SQE. Apart from that, where there are additional bits of information or additional cases or additional articles or additional commentaries that I cite throughout this series, I'll make it very clear that it's additional content, and I'll put that at the end of each of the videos that cite that particular case or that particular source respectively. Fundamentally, the SQE does not require you to go into the facts of cases, the established rules from each of the different cases, only where it is necessary for you to do so. So, for example, you're going to need to know about Donoghue and Stevenson in a basic way, and you're also, of course, going to need to know about Rylands and Fletcher, because that is, of course, a case that formulates a rule. But from there, it's very light on case law for the most part, and that is noticeable from somebody who comes from a law background to the SQE. You will notice the distinct lack of cases that you need to know. But I'll cite them as and when we need to, and if you want to look into it in more detail, I'll put the citation at the end of each video. Just like with everything else, this is going to be the first of 5 lessons that are going to be completely free and available to everyone to get an idea of what this content is going to be. The rest will be behind the SQE members section, so feel free to get yourself a membership for the SQE level. They're called SQE member on the YouTube channel, and in doing so, you also get access to every other piece of content on the channel as well as the SQE videos. So if you want to dive into some human rights law or some law of the sea or something like that, then feel free to do so in your spare time. But for now, I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope you are looking forward to going through the Law of Tort in more detail, and I'll see everybody for the next video in a week's time.